Welcome to OOT, the Out of the Office Investigation. I'm your host, Alex. Today, we're going straight into a technological revolution that's happening right now in spotless laboratories and fertility clinics all over the world. We're talking about the power to select, edit, and ultimately to design human life itself. And Ben, to really wrap our heads around the tools being offered today, we have to pull back the curtain on the ghost in the machine, the really disturbing history and the ideology that built all of this. It's a history built not on healing, but on a chillingly persistent idea: control.
And I'm Ben. Alex, that quote from Jennifer Doudna, one of the pioneers of the CRISPR gene editing technology, really hits the nail on the head. And look, this isn't some critic on the sidelines raising alarms. She's one of the architects of this new reality, and even she is floored by it. I mean, think about it. The stuff we used to only see in dystopian sci-fi movies, designing our kids, weeding out bad traits, engineering a better human, that's now a booming multi-billion-dollar global industry. The power she's talking about, it's not theoretical anymore. You can literally buy it as a service. Yeah, exactly. That awesome and terrifying part is the whole ballgame, isn't it? The awesome side is the promise they sell you on, wiping out horrible genetic diseases like Huntington's or Tay-Sachs. And who could argue with that? But that terrifying part, man, that's where you hear the echoes of some of humanity's darkest impulses. It's that old whisper of eugenics. The idea that we can and should sort people into worthy and unworthy piles. The challenge she's talking about isn't decades away. It's happening in fertility clinics as we speak.
Right, which leads to the big question for our investigation today. This kind of power doesn't just pop up out of nowhere when someone invents a new tool in a lab. It grew from a very specific set of ideas, an ideology that's been quietly evolving and rebranding itself for more than 200 years. That's the key, right? The packaging is brand new. It's slick. It's marketed to us as health and wellness and empowerment. But the core product is old. If we want to understand where we're headed with polygenic risk scores and gene editing, we absolutely have to understand where we came from with skull measuring and fitter family contests. We've got to trace its DNA. All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We've structured our investigation to connect that past directly to our present and our possible future. We'll kick things off with the new reality of design, looking at the incredible tech available right now. Then, we're going to jump back in time to uncover the architecture of inequality, the so-called science that laid all the groundwork. From there, we'll see how those ideas moved from law to laboratory, becoming state-sanctioned policy with brutal consequences. Then, we'll come back to today to really inspect the modern genetic toolkit being sold in clinics. Of course, that puts us right on the ethical horizon, staring down some huge questions. And finally, we'll wrap up by considering what it all means when we start talking about programming the future of our own species. Okay, Ben, let's get into it.
So we're not starting this investigation in some dusty old library. Nope, we're starting right now, in the most modern, high-tech place you can imagine, an in vitro fertilization clinic. This is a place that people think of as full of hope, the miracle of creating life. But it's also, quietly, become the front line for human genetic engineering.
That's so true, Alex. That term, designer baby, it's not sci-fi anymore. It's a real business, but they use friendlier terms like proactive family planning. Right now, the main tool they use is selection. With something called PGTP, clinics can create, say, 10 or 12 embryos and then basically give the parents a report card for each one. These embryos get ranked based on predictions for super complex traits, not just risks for diseases, but things like potential height or even cognitive ability. It is, quite literally, a genetic marketplace. But it doesn't stop with just selecting from the menu. The other major tool is CRISPR-Cas9, which isn't about picking and choosing, it's about editing. It lets you rewrite the genetic code itself. We saw the shocking proof of this in 2018 with the Lulu and Nana case out of China. A scientist created the first babies with edited germlines. And germline is the key word here. It means those changes he made, they're permanent. They get passed down to their children and their children's children, forever. It's a permanent change to a human family line. Now, even though that whole thing caused a huge global scandal, another kind of editing, called somatic editing, is already being used. It's marketed as gene therapy to treat diseases in adults, like sickle cell anemia. And that sounds great, right? But what it also does is it normalizes the idea that our DNA is just software that needs an update.
And to really get what that modern reality means, Alex, we have to hit rewind. To truly grasp the power and the danger of these new tools, we first have to visit what you could call the ideological crime scene, that 19th century intellectual environment where the very idea of ranking and engineering people was born.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this wasn't some fringe idea, right? This was the cutting-edge science of its day, pushed by the smartest people at the best universities in the world.
We're going looking for the intellectual fingerprints.
This timeline is so interesting, Ben, because it's like watching a dangerous idea get built piece by piece, and every step seemed logical to the people taking it. It started back in the Enlightenment with Carl Linnaeus. The guy's famous for classifying plants and animals, but he turned that same lens on people. And he didn't just classify by geography. He assigned inherent character traits to different races, basically creating the software for racial hierarchy. And then came the hardware. In the 1840s, guys like Samuel Morton started using craniometry, skull measuring, to create what looked like a data-driven reason for that hierarchy. He claimed he could prove that whites had bigger skulls and were therefore smarter. It gave old prejudices a shiny new coat of scientific paint. And that's when it got weaponized. Herbert Spencer twisted Darwin's new theory of evolution and applied it to society, creating social Darwinism. Then Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, officially coins the term eugenics. It all leads to this terrifyingly practical stuff from men like Cesare Lombroso in Italy, who claimed it could spot a born criminal just by their face. It was a full-blown ideological assembly line for inequality.
Absolutely. And Ben, let's zoom in on these three figures, because each one built a key pillar for this whole structure. You had Herbert Spencer, who took Darwin's idea of natural selection and warped it into social Darwinism. He's the guy who coined survival of the fittest, and he argued that helping the poor or the sick was actually hurting the human race by letting the unfit reproduce. It's a cold, brutal philosophy, but they dressed it up as rational progress. Then you've got Francis Galton. He founded eugenics on a simple idea. If you can breed cattle for better milk, why can't you breed humans for better intelligence or character? He looked at the world and saw not people, but livestock to be managed. And finally, Cesare Lombroso took this thinking and applied it to the law. He argued that criminals weren't a product of society, they were evolutionary throwbacks, and you could supposedly spot them by their physical features, big jaws, sloped foreheads. To him, crime wasn't a social problem, it was a biological destiny written in your bones.
And the so-called science they used to back this up? When you really look at it, it was just junk. Craniometry is a perfect example. This guy, Samuel Morton, collected hundreds of skulls, filled them with lead shot to measure their volume, and, surprise, surprise, he concluded that Europeans had the biggest skulls and thus the biggest brains. It was presented as objective proof of a racial hierarchy. But years later, when other scientists rechecked his data, they found it was a mess of unconscious bias. He'd packed the European skulls a little tighter, or left out some of the smaller ones from that group to make the average look better. He found the conclusion he wanted to find. And that's a critical lesson, Alex. It was just prejudice dressed up as data. And we have to be so careful today, because an AI algorithm is only as unbiased as the data you train it on. You could say craniometry was the 19th century version of a biased algorithm.
And this is where things get really scary, Ben. Because these ideas didn't stay in the classroom. They jumped from scientific journals straight into government buildings, where they were turned into actual laws and policies. This is the moment the ideology gets its teeth. It's not just a way of seeing the world anymore, it's a tool for shaping it, with the full power of the state behind it. And what so many people forget, or maybe never even knew, is that the United States wasn't just playing along, it was leading the charge.
That's a piece of history that gets overlooked, and I think deliberately sometimes, Alex. The American eugenics movement was huge. We're talking well-funded, organized, and backed by some of the biggest names in industry, like the Carnegies and Rockefellers. They had offices that pumped out propaganda and lobbied state governments to pass laws allowing them to sterilize anyone they considered unfit. And that unfit category was incredibly broad, wasn't it? It wasn't just people with severe disabilities. It was the poor, people who didn't score well on IQ tests, petty criminals, women they considered promiscuous. It was an all-purpose tool of social control.
Absolutely. And this is the really chilling part. Their work was so admired that in the 1930s, Nazi Germany explicitly looked at American eugenics programs, especially California's sterilization laws, and used them as a direct model for their own racial hygiene laws.
The movement basically had two main strategies. There was positive eugenics, which was about encouraging the best people to have more kids, with things like fitter family contests at state fairs. And then there was the much darker negative eugenics, which was all about stopping the unfit from having children, mostly through forced sterilizations.
And that brutal policy got the highest seal of approval possible in the United States. In 1927, the Supreme Court heard the case of Buck v. Bell. They voted 8-1 to uphold Virginia's right to forcibly sterilize a young woman named Carrie Buck because they said she was feeble-minded, just like her mother and her baby daughter. In the majority opinion, the celebrated Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote this absolutely chilling line: 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. It's just devastating. It wrote biological exclusion into American law. It gave the government the power to decide who gets to have a family and who doesn't. You're listening to OSHA with research by El Campesino.
Okay, so with all of that really disturbing history in our minds, let's come back to today. Now we can look at the modern tools being used in IVF clinics and see the ideological DNA they carry. That's right, the language is all new and sanitized. Nobody talks about the feeble-minded anymore. Now they talk about polygenic risk scores and cognitive potential. But that core idea of sorting and ranking human beings, it's back. And this time, it's more powerful and more precise than ever before.
So Alex, how does this actually go down in the clinic? Well, the process is called pre-implantation genetic testing, or PGT. The clinic creates embryos through IVF and grows them in a lab for about 5 or 6 days. At that point, an embryologist does this super delicate biopsy, using a laser to remove just a few cells from the outer layer, the part that would have become the placenta.
Right, so the idea is the embryo itself isn't harmed. That's the goal anyway.
Those few cells get frozen and shipped off to a genetics lab. The lab runs the DNA, generating this massive report card. The results are sent back to the clinic, and this is the moment of truth. The parents sit down with their doctor and go over these reports to decide which of their potential children to bring into the world. Just psychologically, what an unbelievable decision for a person to have to make.
And there are different levels to this report card. The most common one is PGTA, which just checks for the right number of chromosomes to screen for conditions like Down syndrome. Then you have PGTM, which looks for specific single-gene disorders, like if a family knows they carry the gene for cystic fibrosis. For the most part, those two are seen as preventing clear, often tragic medical outcomes. But the newest one, PGTP, man, that is a whole different animal. It doesn't look for one broken gene. It analyzes thousands of genes all at once. And it doesn't give you a definitive yes or no on a disease. It gives you a risk score for complex conditions you might get as an adult, like heart disease or schizophrenia. And this is where the line between medicine and enhancement starts to get really, really blurry.
And that's a huge point, Alex. It's all about probability, not a guarantee. We have to understand the difference between absolute and relative risk. Relative risk is like saying your city has a 30% lower chance of rain than the national average. It doesn't mean it's not going to rain on your house. Absolute risk would be knowing the specific chance of rain on your exact roof in the next hour. It's way more personal and predictive.
Exactly.
And these polygenic risk scores, right now, are all about relative risk. The score just compares an embryo to the average risk in a huge population. A population that's often mostly made up of people of European descent, by the way, so it might tell you an embryo has a lower risk for a heart attack, but it can't guarantee that person won't have one because it can't see the future. It doesn't know what they're going to eat or how much they'll exercise or all the other things that are just as important as genes.
And Ben, this isn't some tiny little niche thing. This is a massive, multi-billion-dollar global industry. You've got companies with slick names like LifeView and Orchid Health and Myome selling these PGTP services to clinics everywhere. And what's frankly alarming is that they aren't just screening for diseases anymore. That was the foot in the door. Now they are explicitly offering to screen for non-disease traits like potential height and, you won't believe it, intelligence or cognitive ability. Let's just pause on that. After everything we just talked about, a whole history of people trying to measure intelligence to create social hierarchies, we now have a commercial service that offers to do it at the embryonic level. We are moving away from a medical model focused on treating infertility and into a straight-up commercial marketplace for genetic upgrades where parents who can afford it, can shop for the traits they want. The goal is no longer just a healthy baby, but a genetically optimized one.
And that shift, Ben, from treatment to optimization, brings us face-to-face with an ethical minefield. These technologies, especially the ones that go beyond just selecting and into actively editing, they are forcing us to ask the most profound, uncomfortable questions our species has ever had to deal with. And we can't just ignore them. The tech is here. We have to decide what it actually means to be human, and what parts of that, if any, are off-limits.
Exactly, Alex. And nothing brings these questions into sharper focus than germline editing. To be crystal clear, this is when you make genetic changes directly to an embryo. The critical part is that those changes are permanent and heritable. They don't just affect one person, they affect their children, their grandchildren, and every single generation after that, forever. It's crossing a bright red line that scientists had agreed for decades should never be crossed. And the Lulu and Nana case in 2018 was the moment that line got erased. It set a precedent. The Pandora's box is open.
This technology basically puts two completely different views of humanity into a head-on collision. On one side, you have a more traditional humanist view. In this story, we come from something sacred, whether that's a creator or just the awesome mystery of nature. Our DNA is a shared inheritance, a legacy. Suffering and death aren't bugs to be fixed. They're just part of a meaningful life. And on the other side, you have the engineering view, the transhumanist view.
In this story, humanity is a flawed prototype that can be improved by science. DNA isn't sacred, it's code, and it's buggy code that needs to be patched and updated. And death itself isn't a mystery, it's the ultimate technical glitch in our biology that needs to be solved. In this worldview, you achieve immortality not through spirit but through data. And you just can't square those two. One sees humanity as a gift, the other sees it as a project. You're listening to OOTO with research by El Campesino.
And that brings us to our final section, Alex. This is where the old ideas of 19th century eugenics and the new ideas of 21st century transhumanism really lock together and become the same thing. Once you start to see human DNA as programmable code, the ultimate goal is total control. The question is no longer if we can rewrite our species, but who gets to sit at the keyboard.
That's the one constant through all of this, isn't it? The core, unwavering belief is that human value isn't something you're born with. It's something that gets assigned to you. It's measured, it's scored, it's ranked. And it doesn't matter what tool you use to do it, whether it's Cesare Lombroso with his calipers measuring a jawbone or a modern genetics lab with a machine giving an embryo a low score for intelligence, the premise is identical. Some humans are just better than others, and we can prove it with numbers. The danger is creating a society of the genetically rich and the genetically poor, where your whole life is mapped out by a lab report you got before you were even born.
Exactly. And the modern transhumanists take this to its logical conclusion. You see it in the reported plans of people like Jeffrey Epstein. He was obsessed with this stuff and apparently had a real plan to use his ranch to seed the human race with his DNA by impregnating dozens of women. It sounds like something out of a bad movie, but this was a real plan. A modern version of the eugenic dream, supercharged by technology and billionaire ego. It's a vision where the human body is just hardware, and our DNA is proprietary code that can be edited, patented, and ultimately owned. And that's not just a metaphor. The goal is to stop treating humanity as a sacred creation and start manufacturing it as a commercial product.
And so this is where our investigation has to end, with this one question. As we are standing right on the edge of being able to literally rewrite our own biology to direct our own evolution, we have to ask, who holds the keyboard? Who gets to decide which human traits are bugs and which are features? Who decides what gets edited out of existence? Is it the scientists, the corporations selling the tech? Is it only the wealthy who can afford to give their kids every advantage, now including genetic ones? Who gets to be the programmer for the future of our species? And maybe the most important question of all is, should anyone have that power at all?